The Montgomery mansion stood like a silent fortress at the edge of the hill, its marble floors and golden chandeliers gleaming under the morning light. But inside, it felt hollow, as if all life had drained away. The walls, once echoing with laughter and music, now carried only whispers of worry. Servants moved quietly through the halls, speaking in low tones, afraid that even a single loud step might disturb the fragile peace that lingered in the house. At the center of it all was Ethan Montgomery, the only son of one of the richest men in the city. A boy who had once been full of charm and curiosity, but now looked like a shadow of himself. His cheeks were pale, his eyes dull, and every day he seemed to shrink a little more into the large armchair by his window. He barely spoke, barely ate, and often sat staring into the distance, as if searching for someone who was no longer there. His father, Richard Montgomery, was a man of power and wealth, respected by everyone who knew his name, but in front of his son's sickness, he was powerless. No amount of money, no modern medicine, no specialist from across the ocean could bring back the spark in Ethan's eyes. Every morning, doctors arrived with confidence and left with confusion, promising recovery that never came. Nurses changed, diets changed, treatments changed, but Ethan only grew weaker. The housekeeper, Mrs. Grant, often sighed quietly, saying it felt like the mansion itself was mourning. Then, one cloudy morning, a new maid walked through the grand doors. Her name was Clara, a woman in her late 30s, dressed plainly, her eyes warm but cautious. She didn't carry the polished grace of the other staff. Instead, she carried something softer, a calmness that made people feel seen. No one paid her much attention at first. After all, she was just another servant. But when she passed Ethan's door for the first time, she paused, her hand resting on the tray she carried. She didn't see an ill boy. She saw loneliness sitting in human form. She noticed how untouched the breakfast tray was, how his room smelled faintly of medicine but lacked any warmth. Clara didn't speak that day. She only adjusted his curtains slightly to let the sunlight in and whispered, "Light helps the soul breathe," before leaving quietly. Ethan didn't respond, but when she left, his eyes followed her to the door. Just for a second, something no one had noticed him do in weeks. Over the next few days, Clara continued her work quietly, polishing the floors, folding laundry, and moving through the mansion with silent efficiency. But she also began doing small things, things no one asked her to. Every morning, she placed a small wildflower from the garden on Ethan's breakfast tray. Sometimes she added a short note, written in simple handwriting, "The sun is kinder today," or "The garden is waiting for company." The boy never replied, but she saw how the flowers disappeared from the tray, one by one. One afternoon, while dusting the hallway, Clara overheard two servants whispering about Ethan's condition. "It's hopeless," one said. "The doctors say his body's fine, but his will is gone." Clara paused, her heart heavy. She had known that feeling once, the emptiness after losing someone dear. That night, while delivering his dinner, she found him sitting by the window, watching the rain. His face looked ghostly in the dim light. "The rain reminds me," she said softly, "that even clouds can't hold their sadness forever." For a moment, she thought he hadn't heard her. But then, ever so slowly, Ethan turned his head. His voice was weak, barely a whisper. "Do you really think clouds get tired?" Clara smiled gently. "I think they let go when it's too heavy to carry." That night, for the first time in weeks, Ethan finished the soup she had brought. Downstairs, the staff was surprised to see the empty bowl. No one understood what had changed, but Clara knew it wasn't the food that healed him that night. It was the warmth of being spoken to, the reminder that someone still saw him. She continued her quiet care, never forcing conversation, never showing pity. She simply stayed, like sunlight filtering through heavy curtains, patient and steady. And though Richard Montgomery remained buried in business calls and meetings, unaware of the quiet miracle beginning to unfold upstairs, The mansion itself seemed to exhale a little. The silence grew softer. A faint sense of hope began to hum in the air, fragile but real. Something had shifted, something gentle, something human, and though no one could name it yet, the first thread of change had been woven into the Montgomerys. Sorrowful home. Clara had been working at the Montgomery mansion for only a short while, yet her quiet presence had already begun to soften the cold atmosphere that hung in the air. She never spoke unnecessarily, never drew attention to herself, but there was something in the gentle way she moved that made people notice her without realizing it. Each morning, she climbed the long staircase to Ethan's room, carrying his breakfast tray. The doctors had instructed her to ensure he ate, but she understood there was more to his illness than hunger or nutrition. So, she started adding small touches to her daily routine, a simple flower from the garden placed beside his meal, a short note written in careful handwriting, and once, a napkin folded neatly with a little smiley face drawn in one corner. These small acts were her way of reaching him, of reminding him that someone still cared enough to notice the details. Ethan never spoke to her. He rarely even looked up when she entered, his gaze fixed on the same spot by the window, where raindrops often slid down the glass in slow, sorrowful trails. But Clara began to notice something subtle. The notes she left were never thrown away. They would appear later on his bedside table, folded carefully, as though he couldn't bring himself to part with them. That tiny gesture was enough to give her hope. It meant he was still listening, still feeling, even if only a little. Days passed, and Clara continued her quiet mission. She never forced words from him. She let silence do its work. She polished the floors, arranged his books, opened the curtains a little wider to let in the light he always tried to avoid. Sometimes she would hum softly while cleaning, an old lullaby she remembered from her childhood, one that carried comfort more than melody. The sound seemed to linger in the air, even after she left the room. One particular evening, heavy clouds covered the sky, and rain poured down in endless sheets. The house was wrapped in gloom, the wind whispering against the windows. Clara went to bring Ethan his dinner, expecting the same quiet indifference, but as she entered, she froze. Ethan wasn't in bed. He was sitting by the window, staring outside, his thin shoulders trembling slightly with every breath. He looked like a lost child, fragile and distant, as if the world outside the glass belonged to someone else. Clara hesitated at the door, unsure if she should speak. She placed the tray gently on the table and turned to leave, but something inside her stopped her. She looked at the boy, his face pale against the dim light, and spoke softly, almost like a whisper meant for the rain itself. "The rain reminds me," she said, "that even clouds can't hold their sadness forever." The words floated in the air between them, delicate yet powerful. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, Ethan turned his head, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since she had arrived. There was surprise in them, and something else, confusion. Maybe even a faint spark of emotion he hadn't felt in a long while. "Do you really think clouds get sad?" he asked in a voice so quiet she almost missed it. Clara smiled gently, her eyes warm. "I think everything does. Sometimes," she replied, "but when they let it fall, the world becomes beautiful again." She left soon after, not waiting for a response, her footsteps fading down the hallway. That night, the sound of rain filled the mansion, but in Ethan's room, something was different. The untouched bowl of soup that had always gone cold on his tray was empty when Clara returned in the morning. She paused, staring at it for a long moment, her heart swelling with a quiet joy she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the food that mattered, it was what it meant. Somewhere between the rain and her words, a tiny door had opened inside Ethan's heart. And though no one else in the house noticed, Clara did. She knew healing had begun, not through medicine or wealth, but through kindness so small, it almost went unseen. The storm outside had passed, But inside that quiet room, another storm was finally beginning to calm. Days slipped quietly into weeks, and the Montgomery mansion began to breathe again, though only faintly. The once motionless boy, Ethan, now sometimes looked out of his window instead of at the floor. And Clara noticed how his gaze lingered longer on the world outside, the rustling trees, the distant sky, the sunlight filtering through the curtains. His health was improving slightly, but Clara could sense that something deeper still held him captive. She had seen pain before, the kind that medicine couldn't cure and words couldn't reach. It was the kind that built walls inside a person's heart, trapping every bit of light. She began to observe more carefully, watching how Ethan avoided mirrors, how he flinched when he heard his father's footsteps in the hallway, and how he turned his face away whenever someone mentioned his mother. There were no photographs of her in his room, but Clara once found a single ribbon tucked inside one of his books, old, faded, but carefully preserved. That was when she understood his sickness wasn't of the body. It was of the heart, a wound that had never been allowed to close. One evening, as she gathered the laundry, Clara overheard the housekeeper whispering to another maid, "Poor boy. He hasn't been the same since his mother died. Mr. Montgomery threw himself into work." The boy hardly saw him after that. The words hit Clara like a quiet blow. She understood too well what that kind of loss did. Years ago, she had lost her own son, her only child, to an illness that came without warning. The grief had hollowed her life, leaving her wandering through years of silence, working wherever she could just to fill the empty hours. And now, seeing Ethan's pain, she felt as though fate had brought her here for a reason. A few days later, on a soft afternoon, when the sun hid behind drifting clouds, Clara invited Ethan to the garden. It had taken her weeks to get him there, but he finally agreed, walking slowly beside her, his steps unsteady but willing. The garden was alive with color, flowers swaying gently in the wind, birds hopping along the fountain's edge. They sat on a wooden bench under an old oak tree, the air filled with the scent of earth and roses. For a while, neither spoke. Then Clara said quietly, "Do you know why I love this garden?" Ethan shook his head, eyes still downcast. "Because it reminds me of my son," she said. "He used to love planting things, even though most of them never grew," he said. "Flowers were like people, they bloom when they feel cared for." Ethan turned to look at her, surprised. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not with pity, but with shared pain. "Your son?" he asked softly. Clara nodded. "He passed away. It's been many years. For a long time, I stopped living too. I thought if I didn't feel anything, I wouldn't hurt. But pain doesn't disappear. It just hides. And one day, I realized that keeping it locked inside was the same as losing him twice." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't look away. Ethan sat very still. His hands were clasped tightly together, and his eyes glistened as he whispered, "I miss my mother." The words fell from his lips like something he had been holding back for far too long. Clara reached out, not to comfort him with empty words, but to let him know she was there. "I know," she said gently, "and she misses you too, wherever she is." That broke something inside him, not in a way that destroyed, but in a way that began to heal. His tears came quietly, at first only a few, then freely, until the weight he had been carrying for years poured out like rain from a breaking cloud. Clara said nothing more. She just sat beside him, letting the silence wrap around them like a blanket. The wind rustled through the leaves, the world seeming to pause in respect. When Ethan finally looked up, his face streaked with tears. His eyes held something new, a faint spark of life, fragile yet real. He took a deep breath, as though air had finally returned to his lungs after a long absence. That was the day Clara saw the first true change in him. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was powerful, the kind of healing that begins quietly, deep within the soul. From that day on, Ethan began to walk in the garden more often. Sometimes he would water the flowers Clara mentioned her son once planted, and sometimes he would sit under the oak tree, just breathing, letting the sun touch his skin. And every time Clara saw him there, she knew that the miracle people waited for wasn't something magic or mysterious. It was simply the moment a broken heart began to believe in life again. The days in the Montgomery mansion began to change slowly, like winter giving way to spring. Ethan, who once spent every hour hidden behind closed doors, now walked through the garden with a lightness that had long been missing. The color had returned to his face, and though he was still thin and fragile, there was a spark of life in his eyes that neither doctors nor medicines had been able to bring back. Every morning, Clara would be in the garden, her apron tied neatly, a watering can in hand, and Ethan would quietly join her. At first, he only watched, standing a few steps away as she tended to the flowers. But soon, he began to help, holding the hose, pulling out weeds, planting new seeds. He wasn't very good at it, and sometimes he made a mess, but Clara never minded. She only smiled and said, "It's all right. Even flowers need a little chaos to grow." Those moments, filled with soft laughter and warm sunlight, became Ethan's medicine. His laughter, which had been lost for so long, began to return in faint echoes, traveling through the hallways that had once felt so empty. The servants whispered to one another about the miracle taking place in the mansion, how the boy who had nearly wasted away was now walking, smiling, even joking. But no one could quite explain it. No one except Clara. She knew it wasn't a miracle born of chance. It was the result of small kindnesses, of patience, of care that came from the heart rather than duty. Meanwhile, Richard Montgomery, the father who had drowned himself in meetings and business calls, began to notice the change in his son, though he didn't fully understand it. He would often see Ethan passing by his study window, a shadow of movement that made him look up from his papers. It startled him at first, that simple sight of life returning to the home he had unknowingly turned into a place of sorrow. Guilt began to stir quietly in his chest, but he pushed it aside, convincing himself that the doctor's treatments were finally working. One morning, however, something unexpected happened that shattered his illusion. He had risen early for a business call, his mind full of figures and deals, when the sound of laughter drifted from the kitchen. It was light, genuine, and unfamiliar, so unfamiliar that he froze. It had been years since laughter had filled his home like that. Curious, he followed the sound down the hall, past the dining room, and stopped at the kitchen door. What he saw made him forget to breathe. Clara stood by the counter, a bowl in her hands, her hair dusted with flour, while Ethan stood beside her, holding a wooden spoon and grinning like a child who had just discovered joy for the first time. The counter was a complete mess, eggshells scattered, milk spilled, flour floating in the air like snow. They were trying to make pancakes, though it looked more like a battle between laughter and clumsiness. "You're supposed to flip it gently." Clara laughed as Ethan tried to turn the pancake, sending it half into the air and half onto the floor. "That was gentle," Ethan insisted, his face bright with amusement. For a long time, Richard simply stood there, watching. The sight of his son laughing again, truly laughing, made something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Gratitude first, for this simple moment, and then guilt, deep and painful. He realized, standing in that doorway, how far he had drifted from the people he loved. His wealth had built a fortress around him, walls so high that even his son's suffering couldn't reach him. All the meetings, the investments, the deals, they suddenly felt meaningless compared to the sound of that laughter. He stepped back quietly, unnoticed, his heart heavy but alive in a way it hadn't been in a long time. That evening, as he sat alone in his study, he couldn't focus on the papers in front of him. The image of Ethan smiling beside Clara replayed in his mind. He thought about his wife, about how she would have loved to see their son like this. Tears stung his eyes, not from sadness alone, but from the realization that love, the one thing he had tried to replace with money, was what his home had been starving for all along. The next morning, Richard didn't go to the office. Instead, he joined them in the garden, awkward at first, unsure of what to say. Ethan looked surprised, but Clara simply handed him a watering can and said with a smile, "Every flower grows better with a little help." Richard took it, and for the first time in years, he worked beside his son, quietly, humbly, as sunlight spilled over the three of them. In that moment, the mansion that had once been silent began to bloom again, not just with flowers, but with hope. Months had passed since the first time Clara walked through the Montgomery mansion's grand doors, and now everything inside felt different, lighter, warmer, alive again. Ethan, once a pale and silent boy lost in his sorrow, was no longer the fragile figure confined to his room. His cheeks had color, his smile came easily, and his laughter had become a part of the household's daily rhythm. He spent his mornings in the garden, his afternoons helping Clara with small chores, and his evenings talking with his father, something he hadn't done in years. The servants often paused in their work just to watch him walk down the stairs, tall, bright-eyed, and full of life. They called it a miracle, the way he had transformed. The doctors who visited could only shake their heads in wonder, saying they'd never seen such recovery without medical explanation. But Clara, who stood quietly at the edge of every joyful moment, knew the truth. It wasn't magic, it wasn't medicine, it was love, patience, and the gentle touch of understanding. She had seen darkness in Ethan's heart and had refused to turn away from it. Her care had not only nursed his body, but it also healed his spirit. One cool evening, when the sky turned gold and purple with the setting sun, Richard Montgomery asked Clara to come to his office. The room, usually filled with business papers and silence, felt unusually heavy that night. Richard stood by the window, his back to her, staring out at the sprawling garden below, the same garden where his son had rediscovered life. When he finally turned, his eyes glistened, the confident sharpness of a businessman replaced by the tenderness of a father. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "you've done something no one else could. You saved my son." Clara smiled faintly, but before she could speak, he added with a trembling breath, "But you also saved me." There was a pause, deep and full of meaning. Richard stepped closer, struggling to find words. "I thought success meant protecting him with money, surrounding him with comfort. I never realized that what he needed wasn't comfort, it was connection." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of guilt finally breaking free. Clara's gaze softened. "Sometimes, sir," she said gently, "all a soul needs is to be seen." Her words hung in the air, like a whisper of truth that lingered long after the sound had faded. Richard lowered his head, and for the first time in many years, he felt humble, not as a man of wealth, but as a man who had learned the true meaning of care. That night, as Clara left the office, she passed the living room where Ethan sat at the piano, playing softly. The melody floated through the hallways, wrapping the mansion in warmth. Clara stopped for a moment, watching him, pride glimmering in her eyes. The boy who had once been lost to grief was now filled with hope, his spirit alive with promise. In the following weeks, the mansion changed completely. Where there had once been silence, there was laughter. Where dust had gathered on picture frames, new memories began to form. Richard started taking time away from his work to have breakfast with Ethan, and sometimes joined him in the garden. The two of them would often be seen walking together under the morning sun, their conversation filled with light teasing and quiet joy. Clara continued her duties as before, but now, every task carried a touch of love, not the love of obligation, but the love of someone who had found purpose again. The servants noticed that even the air inside the house felt different. It smelled of baked bread, blooming flowers, and something else, peace. One evening, months later, Ethan brought Clara a small pot of white daisies he had grown himself. "For you," he said shyly, because you made things bloom again." She smiled, touched beyond words, and as she placed the pot on the kitchen window, she whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, not for the miracle itself, but for the reminder that miracles are born from simple human hearts willing to care. From that day on, the Montgomery mansion was never silent again. It stood not just as a symbol of wealth, but as a home reborn through kindness. Laughter filled its rooms, love warmed its corners, and even the old walls seemed to hum with life. For those who entered, it was clear that what had once been broken had not just been mended, it had been transformed. And somewhere deep inside, Clara knew that the greatest miracles are not the ones that come from heaven, but the ones that grow quietly in the hearts of people who dare to see and heal one another.